Greetings from the Trumbull Congregational Church. My name is Tim Hare, and I am the pastor here. It's a joy to be able to share this sermon with you, which is a sermon that I shared online with my church on July 12th. I did my first COVID-era funeral a couple of weeks ago. The whole service was held at the cemetery with a small, socially distanced, mask-wearing congregation of close friends and family. COVID-19 actually was the second severe pandemic that Beatrice, the deceased, had lived through, or at least into. The first was the Spanish flu of 1918. Beatrice, you see, was 104 when she passed away. Not knowing her at all, beyond the conversation that her son and I had prior to doing the service, I decided to spend some time in my sermon reflecting upon the fairly dramatic change that Beatrice had experienced in her lifetime. When she was born, women in this country weren't even allowed to vote. The first human flight was only 13 years old, but by the time she died, we had once again launched astronauts into space. Beatrice was a huge Yankees fan. She watched all of Joe DiMaggio's 13 All-Star seasons. In fact, she spent her 100th birthday at Yankee Stadium. She was already 3 years old when Babe Ruth came to the Yankees. So perhaps she was able to see him play as well, but if she did, it wasn't on TV. TVs didn't start appearing in people's homes until Beatrice was in her mid-30s. She lived through 2 world wars, the civil rights movement, the assassination of a president, the birth of computers, globalization, social media, and the unveiling of the iPhone 11. The world she entered and the world she left were radically different, which makes you think just how resilient and adaptable we really are or can be. Beatrice came to mind again when on Facebook the other day I saw an old black and white picture of women with their babies in hand fleeing what looked like a bombed out London. The post imagined your life had you been born in the year 1900. By the time you were 18, 22 million had died in World War I. And soon after that, the Spanish flu killed 50 million people. When you were 29, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed and the Great Depression began. At 33, the Nazis came to power in Germany. When you were 45, World War II ends with 60 million people dead. And shortly after that, of course, you lived through the Korean War. Then after that, you saw the Vietnam War. Ultimately, the point of the post was to provide some perspective and to thereby provide some comfort. Yes, we should wear masks despite the inconvenience. It said, yes, we should distance despite the isolation, but we also have food, electricity, running water, Wi-Fi, even Netflix. The post reads, none of that existed back in the day, but humanity survived those circumstances and never lost their joy for living. A small change in our perspective can generate miracles, it says. We should be thankful that we are alive. We should do everything we need to do to protect and help each other. I agree that a small shift in perspective can yield dramatic results. This is especially true in matters of faith. Just consider the difference in thinking of God primarily as the one you must please versus thinking of God as the one who is eternally pleased to give God's self to you. That shift alone can turn your faith life from one of endless striving and depletion to a deep source of assurance and joy. But that said, I'm not so sure the post really works all that well. What I notice about it mostly is the violence of our history. We go from war to war with small breaks in between. We just can't seem to figure out a different way of being, a way that isn't so colored by force, much of it lethal. I've also never really appreciated the comfort in knowing that, well, things could be a lot worse. I mean, maybe that works for you, and if it does, that's okay. But for me, there can be a subtle dismissing of one's pain in that. Like, the answer to suffering is to scold yourself because others have suffered more. Of course, it depends on the level of suffering involved. Wearing a mask and practicing some distance is nothing compared to losing everything and fleeing from war on foot with your baby in hand. So perhaps we can find strength in the strength that others have shown in the face of suffering. But what the post doesn't say is that our collective suffering right now is far more than simple inconveniences. Multiple crises are hitting us all at once. There's the public health crisis of a global pandemic. There's the economic crisis of so many jobs and livelihoods lost. There's the political crisis of a country that is radically divided. And of course, a racial justice crisis. It's calling us to examine and change racialized systems in our country. There are other crises too, like the growing crisis over policing, as well as what seems to be a mounting battle between ideology on one hand and freedom of speech on the other. Of course, none of this is to even mention the many personal and individual crises we carry with us as we live and suffer our losses and hurts. And what I'm getting at is that this time is harder than we may consciously understand. If you're feeling its weight in your body and your soul, if you're tired and sad somewhere deep within you, or kind of lost from yourself in some ways, you aren't alone. What's happening now is a lot to take and a lot to apprehend, maybe too much so. And if it's getting to you, you're in good company. The biblical tradition for handling such situations is actually not to remind yourself that others have had it worse. It's to express honestly the pain within you. It is to lament, and there are examples of doing just that abound throughout the Psalms. Here's one you may have heard: my God, why have you forsaken me?" Of course, those are words from Jesus on the cross. But he's quoting Psalm 22, which continues, "Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest." The biblical tradition is to lay it all out before God, to share your truth with God, even if it's a truth that you'd be embarrassed to tell, or a truth you don't fully understand, or one you think you shouldn't feel. What the laments tell us is that God meets us where we are, not where we should be, or where we think we should be. God can handle our honest outpours, our pessimism, our discouragement, our anger, our stress and sadness, and whatever else. In fact, I think that God does more than just handle these expressions. I think God uses them. We let them out, and then often we find ourselves in a better place to hear what God has to say. We see a hint of that in today's psalm. The psalmist is, quote, severely afflicted. He, quote, holds his life in his hands continually. His enemies have laid a snare for him. But in voicing his afflictions, he's also reminded of his joy and of God's faithfulness. He says, "Your decrees are my heritage forever. They are the joy of my heart. This is a pattern we see repeated many times throughout the Psalms. And I think the confession is that these laments, or perhaps our own laments, position us to be a little more receptive to the new thing, the surprising thing, the grace-filled thing, the redemptive thing, the simple thing, the powerful thing, the sustaining thing that God is doing. In his letter to the Romans, Paul talks a lot about life in the flesh versus life in the spirit. Unfortunately, flesh too often has been understood literally as if it is an indictment on the body, as if our physical natures are somehow bad. But this is neither true nor Paul's point. Life in the flesh, for Paul, represents the uninspired life, a life removed from God's animating and Holy Spirit. Life in the flesh is a life that subscribes to the dominating power structures of the empire and its depleting and demoralizing messages about human purpose and value and meaning. Life in the flesh is a commitment to the status quo. Whereas life in the spirit is life that is transformed by the indwelling of the eternal God. It is life that knows potential and possibility beyond the conventional because it accepts the presence of transcendence. It is life of abiding value because it embraces an abiding God. A life of sacred purpose because it knows a holy love for all. A life of peace and hope because it knows a God of resurrection. Access to this life is a gift from God. Experiencing it is a choice. Choose life in the Spirit, says Paul, because it is the Spirit that has been given to you in this life. The thing is, it's important to recognize that this is not a once-for-a-lifetime kind of choice. It's the kind of choice you make daily. And it's the kind of choice you make over and against competing and powerful alternatives. The other day I was listening to a speaker who said, if you succeed in choosing it 10 out of 10 times, you've probably got the wrong idea. 3 out of 10 is probably more realistic. 3 out of 10 is probably a sign that you get the radical alternative that such a choice is. 3 out of 10 is probably a sign that you've felt the liberating joy that accompanies such a choice. Now, maybe he's wrong. Maybe the more practiced we are, the better we get at it. But his point is that the challenges are real. The flesh is seductive, to put it in Pauline terms. The world's ways play powerfully in the shaping of our lives. Maybe that's why lament is so counterintuitively useful to God. In lament, we bare our souls, and in being so revealed, we realize both our need and our deep desire. In a kind of lament over the state of the world in 2011, Brian Zahn preached some words I'll quote now, which both express this desire for what it is Christ offers and remain all the more relative here in 2020. He writes, "Here we are, 20 centuries after Caiaphas, who for the sake of his nation, and Pilate for the sake of his empire, condemned Jesus, that preacher of peace, to death in favor of retaining the status quo of violent revolution and militaristic empire. Wars have continued to define us. Freedom has continued to be largely understood as the power to kill. Violence has continued to be viewed as a legitimate way of shaping our world. All in an outright betrayal of Jesus Christ and his revolutionary ideas. Ideas that were rejected by superpower ideology and colluding religion on Good Friday, but vindicated by the living God on Easter Sunday. Yes, Easter Sunday and the resurrection of Jesus changes everything. It's the hope of the world, the dawn of a new age, the rising of the new Jerusalem on the horizon of humanity's burnt-out landscape. So isn't it time we abandon our de facto allegiance with Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas and their worn-out, death-dealing ideas and started listening to and embracing the revolutionary, life-giving ideas of that preacher of peace whom God has raised from the dead and declared to be Lord by the power of an indestructible life? Isn't it time we were converted and became as children who have the capacity to imagine the radical otherness of the kingdom of God? Isn't it time for the stranglehold of the status quo to give way to the possibilities of prophetic imagination? Isn't it time for the peaceable kingdom of Christ to be considered a viable option in the here and now, and not forever relegated to the sweet by and by? Isn't it time? I pray it is. I believe it is. My friends, here's where I'm at. All of these crises converging on us at once are exhausting, they are overwhelming, and they are depleting. They are draining me. And I know I'm not alone. But in being drained, I'm also opening to a desire for something better. For more love, for more justice, for more peace. And more importantly, they're awakening me to my need and my desire for a God who can do what I alone, what we alone cannot. A God whose wisdom is worth our trust. A God whose great joy is to grant us life in the Spirit, and to shine that life through us as we learn to follow. I know I'm not alone in that either. In fact, I hope you are with me.